see about one of those a year. So, just less than 1% of tenants will do this. And there are ways that you can minimise your risk to things like this and also minimise your financial risk when things like that occur. And I'm going to go through them in a minute. Tenant from hell. I think somebody at the back said tenant from hell. So, the unapproachable tenant that doesn't pay rent. You ring them up to see what is going on, and there's a whole series of F words that are coming out of the phone line. You deal with these all the time. How do you deal with a tenant like that? And this is what we're going to be going through. Rent not paid. So in Australia, in Adelaide right now, I think the average property will sell for about $384,000, and the average rent is about $350 to $400 per week. So there's already a shortfall between what you're receiving in rent and what you're paying out the bank in what you're paying to the bank to cover the mortgage. So the average property at the moment in Adelaide is negatively geared. So when you have a tenant that's not paying rent on time, it puts a further financial strain on people, and it does cause, a lot of headaches. Now with property management, it's basically a cookie cutter system. There's basically 5 things to getting it right. And they are how you select the tenant, how you induct the tenant, how you control arrears when the property does go into arrears, how you do periodic inspections, and the correct vacating procedure. Now we're going to be talking about the 3 that are highlighted, but very, very quickly, tenant induction. When you sit down with a tenant to take them through the lease and what's going to happen, you don't just say, okay, well, here's the lease document, just sign here and it's all good. We explain to tenants, or you should be explaining to tenants exactly what's going to happen. So what's going to happen if they don't pay rent on time, what will happen if they don't pay water invoices on time, what will happen if they trash the property, all the rules. It's like taking children inside a supermarket and explaining to them, we're not going to buy lollies, we're not going to buy ice cream, what we're going to buy is these 3 ingredients and that's it, and we're going to go out. And if you have a tantrum, we're actually going to leave the supermarket. So when you explain to somebody up front what's going to happen, it actually minimises the risk. You agree? Yep. Okay. The other one, correct vacating procedure, just means that you can't just go into a property and say, well, your rent, the lease is over, I want the property back. There is a procedure to follow. Okay, tenant selection. Has anyone applied for a mobile phone recently? To get a mobile phone? Oh, people have had mobile phones now for years. But when you do apply for a mobile phone the first time, they screen you to death. The screening procedure is so detailed. But we get a lot of private landlords. So I'm going to be using a lot of private landlords as negative examples in here. That's not because we don't like private landlords, and that's not because they're not managing the properties properly. It's because when they're not managing the property properly, then they come to us. So we don't see the ones that are getting it all right and doing it. I'm sure that there's some out there that are doing it better than some agents, but we see it when they stuff them all up. So that's why I'm using them as examples. But we do see, we've taken a property a few years ago from a landlord. He had no idea who the tenant was, what the name of the tenant was in there. But not only that, but the tenant had exchanged tenancies about 3 times. So they kept giving the property to somebody else, and then somebody else, and then somebody else. So he had no idea who was actually living in that property. And I don't know what was going on in there. All the floors were damaged in that property. This man was knocking on the door every 2 weeks and collecting rent in cash. So he had no idea. Now, when it's like that, you have no idea what recourse to actually take. If the tenant does fall into arrears, you don't know who to go after. So it's really difficult to actually get the tenant out. It almost falls under squatting rules. So you need to know exactly who is in your property. Now we take an ID and we screen the tenants really thoroughly. We take 100 points of ID, And we ask them questions, you know, who are you renting from? You know, what's your employment? How much are you making? You know, pets on the property, all of that kind of thing. What do you think the most important thing is when we're actually screening tenants? That's important, but we place, okay, when we're selecting a tenant, yes, we make sure that they're not on a blacklist. Most of them are not. But what do you think we base the most weight on? The way they keep their car. We do have a sneak peek at the cars if we can on the way out. Yep, but we don't place the major importance on that. The major importance is actually, you said references. Yeah, the major importance, they are important, is the rent ledger from another real estate agency. So we want to see rent paid on time. And so we would ask another real estate agency to give us a rent ledger, and that way we can take all ambiguity out of it. We can see when the tenant has paid and when they haven't paid, and when there's been vacancies, when they've paid late. Because once it hits an agent's trust account, it can't be undone. And if it is undone, it's shown as being undone. So that's the most important thing. What do you think that's more important than the income they're making? Exactly. So they might be making $2,000 a week. How do you know they don't have a gambling habit? So we want to establish a regular record of payment. That is the most important thing that we actually look for. And employment is important. We make sure that the employment is, the rent is no more than 30% of the income. So if they're applying for a $300 a week property, they should be making about $900 to $1,000 a week, or combined income if they're a couple. Okay, does that make sense? Yep. Excellent. Yes, you can. Yes, please.
Are you getting direct debits straight from the employer?
Sometimes, but the onus is on the tenant to do direct debits straight from the employer or straight from Centrelink. So, but they have to set them up. EFT, direct debit. Yep. So most of them, 99% of them are done like that. Every now and then, they'll come in cash. If we had 200 tenants coming in cash, we'd lose our mind. So. Now, be really, really careful about causing vacancies. We're facing a market right now where there's actually more rental properties on the market than there are available tenants. So it's a little bit different to what it was 2 years ago, and the properties are staying on the market for a little bit longer than they used to about 2 years ago. 2 years ago, we used to have an open inspection. 14 groups of people will come through, we'll get 5 or 6 applications, ring the landlord and say, who do you want to choose? Now, they're making us work. Now the properties are sitting there, people will ring up and say, can I have a look at it in an hour? And yes, you can. Fine. It's worse with units. It's actually worse with units. They're staying on the market a little bit longer, and that's a simple supply and demand. There's more units available in the rental pool than there are houses. Newer ones are going really quickly. So we've got a lot of success rate with newer properties, depending on where they are. If they're in the eastern or western suburbs, they go really, really quickly. If there's somewhere like Mawson Lakes, they're all new. It's competing with 300 other new properties, so it's going to stay on the market for a little bit longer. If it's a new one, we had a new one in Clarence Gardens. First open inspection, it went. That's because there's not a lot of new stock, a lot of new 4-bedroom stock in Clarence Gardens. So unique properties, take them away from the equation that I'm talking about, because I'm talking it very generally. Usually, high-end properties in the eastern market will rent really, really quickly as well. So, you know, your $800 to $1,200 a week properties, there's not a lot of them in a tenant pool at the moment, so they will go very quickly. So they're sort of excluded from what I'm talking about. But your very general 3-bedroom house will stay on the market a little bit longer than it was years ago. So when you're screening an application, say you get an application from a tenant coming in, they've got assuming all of the information is there, so you can ring the employer, the references, verify the blacklist, all of that kind of thing. And we do have a look at the blacklist. The main tenant blacklist database is called TICA, T-I-C-A, and that will give us a history of the tenant in the last 5 years. So they would be on there if somebody had bothered to put them on there and they had left a property owing money to a landlord. So what do you think the average time should be to screen an application form? Good. Anyone else? Yeah, you guys are awesome. People usually say, when I do this presentation, people say about a week, a month, you know, if you take a month to screen an application form, I could guarantee you 100% you'll ring the tenant a month later and they'll be gone. You can ring them 2 days later and they will be gone. They would have already found another property. So a couple of hours is usually what we take. Assuming that people get back to you, that is what we aim for. We aim for a couple of hours, assuming that you can get hold of the landlord, because the landlord ultimately approves the application, but we try to push them through as soon as possible. If you have a qualified application in front of you for a property, you know, all the ticks are in place, and there's no reason why you can't just push that through very, very quickly. That makes sense? Yep.
You talked before about unique features in properties. What kind of unique features do you see being one of the most desirable?
Huge properties.
Big?
So yeah.